Death is scary enough, but what these victims went through in their final moments is almost too brutal to imagine. From a vape battery exploding inside a man's mouth, to a hidden blue-ringed octopus inside a shell that leaves an unsuspecting tourist completely paralyzed. Hello again, everyone. You're watching Last Records. It was March 15th, 2020, in central Manchester, England. The outdoor market area in the city centre was doing its usual mid-morning thing, vendors setting up, people cutting through on their way somewhere else, cold enough that most people had a jacket on. Kieran Maddox was 34, lived in Manchester for about 8 years, worked in digital marketing. Pretty regular guy. He had quit smoking about 18 months before this and switched to vaping, gradually cutting his nicotine levels down over time, which takes more discipline than people give it credit for. He carried a spare loose battery in his shirt pocket so he could swap it out mid-morning, something he had done for months without any issue. That morning, he had also thrown his door key and a small metal multi-tool into the same pocket because he was running late. I do that all the time, honestly. Just grab everything off the counter and shove it all in the same pocket. The difference here is what was sitting in there with that battery. So, lithium-ion battery. When the terminals of a bare cell make contact with something metal, like a key or a multi-tool sitting in the same pocket, current starts flowing through that metal instead of through the battery's own protection system. That generates heat inside the cell fast, and once it reaches a certain point, it enters what is called thermal runaway, a self-sustaining reaction that does not stop until the battery vents and ignites. The early stages feel like absolutely nothing, which is kind of the whole problem. Kieran had been walking for about 10 minutes when he noticed a faint warmth in his chest. He adjusted his jacket and kept moving. By the time he reached the market, it had become actual heat concentrated right where the pocket sat. He took out his device, realized the battery was running low, and reached into his pocket for the spare. And because his hands were full, he did what a lot of people do without thinking about it. He held the loose battery between his lips while he worked the device with both hands. That is it. That is the whole thing. The battery vented directly inside his mouth. The pressure was enough to fracture both upper front teeth at the gum line and drive fragments back into the soft tissue of his inner lip and tongue. Superheated gas followed immediately into his throat. The flame lasted less than 3 seconds inside his mouth. But 3 seconds of direct flame contact with unprotected soft tissue at that temperature causes full thickness burns across every surface it touches. And it touched everything. That's shorter than a sneeze. Wild, right? He pulled back and took 2 steps away. Witnesses described one sharp exhale, then silence. He sat down where he was standing, and a couple of people moved toward him. Kieran was conscious, eyes tracking, breathing in short, wet intervals that kept getting harder to hear and harder to take. Emergency services arrived 4 minutes after the call. At the burns unit, doctors found full-thickness burns to the back of his throat, soft palate, base of the tongue, and upper airway. Tooth fragments had been recovered from the airway, and the swelling was already too advanced for standard intubation, so a surgical airway was established within the first hour. The burn edema kept advancing through the night. There were periods where his eyes were open, and the monitors showed he was aware of his surroundings, but despite every effort to keep his airway open, the swelling continued to worsen. Kieran died 14 hours after the explosion. Investigators later recovered the battery casing from the ground, split along one side, with its terminals fused to the metal multi-tool from his pocket, confirming that the short circuit had triggered the thermal runaway. The case was ruled an accidental death. Over in Brazil, an untreated tooth infection crept through a woman's jaw and into her neck over 3 weeks until there was simply no air left to breathe. It was October 7th, 2018, in a mid-sized city in the south of Brazil, one of those residential districts where the apartment buildings are packed close together and the streets are narrow. The apartment on the 4th floor had been quiet for 2 days, the television running non-stop, and the neighbor below finally knocked when she realized she had not seen the woman from upstairs since the weekend. Beatriz Mendez was 38, worked remotely as a translator, spent most of her time at home, and kept a schedule that was largely her own. Private, independent, the kind of person who could go days without leaving the apartment, and that was just normal for her. She had been dealing with a painful lower tooth for close to 3 weeks before any of this happened, taking anti-inflammatory medication, avoiding hard food on that side, telling herself it was getting better. Painkillers make this kind of thing tricky because they do not fix anything. They just make the problem quiet enough to ignore. A dental abscess that goes untreated does not stay where it started. It moves through the soft tissue of the jaw, down through the floor of the mouth, and into the spaces between the muscles of the neck. This is called Ludwig's angina, and what makes it so dangerous is how unremarkable the early symptoms are. Difficulty swallowing feels like a sore throat. A voice that starts changing sounds like a cold coming on. Most people would not connect any of that back to a tooth. 9 days before she was found, Beatrice messaged a friend saying her jaw was still bothering her and that she had a swollen gland in her neck. Her friend told her to go see someone. She said she would if it did not improve by the weekend. 4 days before she was found, she placed a grocery order, smaller than usual, mostly soft foods and juice, which tells you everything about how eating had been going. 3 days before, she missed a client call without explanation, which was not like her. 2 days before, the television came on and stayed on. Have you ever been in a space where the TV is just running in the background and nobody is actually watching it? That's what this apartment looked like for 2 straight days. What happened in those last hours is reconstructed entirely from what investigators found in the apartment because there was nobody else there. As the infection spread through the tissues beneath her jaw and into her neck, the swelling gradually narrowed her airway. Every breath required more effort than the last, until her body could no longer move enough air to keep up. The neighbor got no answer at the door on the evening of October 7th and asked the building manager to unlock the apartment with a spare key. Beatrice was found lying on her side on the floor between the couch and the coffee table, only a few feet from her phone. A partially full glass of water sat on the table beside her. Her lower face and neck were visibly swollen, consistent with the advanced infection later documented during the post-mortem examination. Responders arrived within 9 minutes, but she had already been dead for an estimated 36 to 48 hours. Investigators documented her final internet search at 11:14 that evening, roughly translated as difficulty breathing, swollen neck, what to do. The grocery order, missed client call, television left running, and the findings from the post-mortem examination helped reconstruct her final days. The examination confirmed Ludwig's angina originating from an untreated abscess in the lower left molar that had spread over approximately 18 to 21 days, causing fatal airway obstruction. The case was ruled a natural death. Dying like that is bad enough, but dying that way alone, with help technically one button away, is a different kind of brutal. At a quiet house in Portland, a man mixed 2 common drain chemicals and filled his basement with gas that started burning his lungs before he could get out. It was April 6th, 2019, at a quiet house in Portland, Oregon. Saturday morning, the kind where people are usually doing laundry, yard work, coffee, boring house stuff. Kyle Jean had been in the basement since a little after 8, trying to clear a drain that had been backing up since winter. Kyle was 44 and had owned that house for 11 years. He was not a professional handyman, but he was patient, careful, and the kind of guy who would watch a few tutorials and try fixing something himself before paying someone to do it. That morning, he was using a bleach-based drain cleaner, then adding an acidic product he had seen recommended online. I get the impulse, not gonna lie. Half the internet is people telling you there's a cheaper way to fix something, and the other half is the comment section explaining why that was a terrible idea. When bleach-based cleaners mix with acidic products, they can release chlorine gas. And chlorine gas is not just a bad smell. It reacts with the moisture in your eyes, throat, and lungs, meaning the moment Kyle breathed it in, the gas began turning the wet surfaces inside his body into a chemical burn. His eyes, airway, and lung tissue were being attacked at the same time. In a small basement with poor ventilation, where is that gas supposed to go? It can build fast enough to cause serious injury before a person even understands what is happening. Kyle poured the first chemical into the drain and waited. Then he added the second one. The reaction started immediately, fizzing at the drain opening, and a sharp smell hit him before he had even stepped back. The basement was about 350 square feet, with one small window on the far wall closed and the door at the top of the stairs shut. The gas had nowhere useful to go. He turned toward the stairs and got one hand on the railing. His eyes were burning so badly he could barely keep them open. Not irritation, actual burning, because chlorine reacts with moisture on contact. He started moving by feel, but the gas was already in his throat, his airways spasming, and every cough pulled more of it deeper into his lungs. He never made it to the door. When responders found him, he was back at the base of the stairs. Evidence suggested he had reached the staircase before going down, which means at some point he was moving, trying. Whether he was conscious the entire time at the base of those stairs, nobody can say for certain. What is known is that every breath down there was making things worse. Chlorine damages the tissue that moves oxygen into the blood, and fluid begins collecting in the injured areas. Each breath becomes wetter and less useful. The body does not just get irritated, it starts to fail. His wife opened the basement door around 9:40. She could see Kyle at the bottom of the stairs. The smell hit her immediately, and that may be the cruelest detail in the whole case. He was right there, and she could not go to him without risking becoming a second victim. She shut the door and called for help. Responders arrived within 7 minutes, brought him out with protective equipment, and started oxygen on the front lawn. He was unconscious by then. He was transported and placed on mechanical ventilation with severe chemical burns to the airways and lungs. Getting him out of the basement was not enough. Chlorine damage can keep progressing after the exposure ends, the lungs swelling, fluid building, oxygen transfer getting worse regardless of treatment. Kyle died 31 hours later from acute respiratory failure. The basement was where it started, but the dying took over a day. It's not the loudest or bloodiest death in this episode, but it is one of the worst in a very specific way. It was an accident anyone could make, with products anyone can buy on an ordinary Saturday morning. At Topsail Beach, North Carolina, a man climbed into a sand hole on a normal summer afternoon, not realizing the walls were already starting to crack around him. It was June 14th, 2017, at Topsail Beach in North Carolina. Summer afternoon, busy shoreline, umbrellas everywhere, people doing exactly what people do at the beach. Derek Tillman and a few friends had been digging in the dry sand about 40 meters from the waterline. Derek was 31, lived in Raleigh, worked in logistics, and had been coming to that part of the coast since he was a kid. He was active, practical, and usually the first person to start doing something instead of just sitting around. Digging a hole at the beach was not a dare or a stunt, it was just beach boredom. Sit in one place long enough and suddenly everybody thinks they understand construction. Digging in dry beach sand feels harmless because it is fun, familiar, and honestly kind of stupid in the best way, but that sand is not nearly as stable as it looks. Once a hole gets deep enough, the walls can behave more like loose grain than solid ground. Around 3 feet deep is already where things start getting risky, especially if the walls are near vertical. And when sand collapses around someone's torso, the problem is not just being covered, it is pressure. Sand packs tightly around the chest and abdomen, and suddenly even a simple breath takes work. The hole had taken about 45 minutes to dig, first by hand and then with a plastic shovel from someone's bag. By the time Derek climbed in, it was close to 5 feet deep, with the sand up around his chest while he stood at the bottom. His friends were around the rim, and someone had taken a photo a few minutes earlier. Thin vertical cracks had started showing on one side, but unless you know what those mean, they just look like lines in sand. Then the south wall gave way, but it did not crumble slowly. A section roughly 4 feet wide dropped inward all at once, packing against Derek's chest, left side, and abdomen. His arms were pinned before he could raise them. His head and shoulders stayed above the surface, which made it look less serious for a few seconds. He could still talk, and he was still looking at his friends, but he could not take a full breath. His friends started digging right away with their hands. The problem was that the hole was narrow and the walls were unstable, so pulling sand away from one area let more slide in from above. One friend went toward the beach access to find a shovel and get a better phone signal. The others kept trying to clear space around his chest. Derek stayed conscious for several minutes. His voice got quieter because pushing air out was becoming harder. His words got shorter, then further apart. The people around him were close enough to hear the change, which honestly might be the worst part of this. They were right there, they were doing something, it just was not changing the pressure fast enough. A man from a nearby umbrella came over with a small beach shovel, but by then, Derek had stopped responding to his name. His eyes were still partially open. His chest was no longer visibly moving. The call was placed around 3:42 in the afternoon. Responders reached him roughly 14 minutes later after getting equipment across the soft sand. He was pulled out and resuscitation was attempted on the beach. He was transported and pronounced dead about 50 minutes after arrival. The cause of death was asphyxiation from thoracic compression. The sand had squeezed his chest tightly enough for long enough that his lungs could not expand properly. There were no broken bones, no spinal injury, no major external trauma. His phone was recovered from a bag near the hole, with the last photo showing him standing inside it about 3 minutes before the collapse. The death was ruled accidental. By the next day, the sand probably looked normal again. That feels unfair in a way I cannot really explain. Next story takes place at a garage in Tucson, Arizona, where an older truck tire was being inflated on a hot Saturday afternoon, and one piece of rusted metal was about to turn the wheel into a weapon. It was August 9th, 2015, on a residential street in Tucson, Arizona. The garage door was open, a box fan was running in the corner, and the afternoon heat was sitting over everything. Donald Payne had his old Ford truck up on jack stands, with the rear passenger wheel sitting on the concrete beside him. Donald was 53 and had been working on his own vehicles for most of his adult life. He was not a mechanic, but he knew his way around a garage and liked being able to fix things himself. Not in a careless way either. He was the type to take his time, lay the tools out, check what he was doing. That afternoon, he was trying to reseat a tire bead after patching a slow leak, something he had done before, but not enough for it to feel like a quick job. Older, heavy truck wheels can be more dangerous than they look, especially split rim or multi-piece assemblies. Instead of one solid rim, they use a separate locking ring that holds the tire in place once it is inflated. If that ring is not seated properly, inflation pressure can turn it into a projectile. Donald's locking ring had surface rust and a slight bend along one edge from years of use. He cleaned it, lubricated it, and checked it by hand, but it still was not sitting perfectly flush. From above, crouched over a tire in a hot garage, that is not always obvious. He connected the compressor and started inflating. At around 30 pounds per square inch, he crouched down to inspect the bead line and leaned in toward the valve stem to read the pressure. The locking ring separated at about 37 pounds per square inch. It came off the side facing him and struck the upper left side of his face, jaw, and neck in one hit. The impact fractured his orbital socket, cheekbone, and jaw in multiple places and opened a deep laceration across the left side of his neck. He was thrown backward about 3 feet and came to rest against the workbench. Donald was conscious after the impact. He was on the garage floor, alone, bleeding heavily from his neck and facial injuries. One eye was no longer functioning. The compressor had been knocked sideways but was still cycling. The box fan was still running. His wife was inside the house, about 15 feet away through a closed interior door, and the television was on. The part that feels so wrong here is the ordinary noise around him. The fan was running, the compressor was cycling, the TV was on inside, and all of it made the garage sound like nothing serious had happened. He was there for an estimated 12 to 15 minutes. The bleeding from the neck wound was continuous. He could see the interior door from where he was on the floor, but the injury and blood loss made movement almost impossible. His wife came out to bring him a cold drink and found him against the workbench. She called for help from inside the house. Responders arrived within 6 minutes. Donald was conscious but fading and had lost a significant amount of blood. He was transported and taken into surgery that evening. He survived the initial surgery but never fully regained consciousness. He died 4 days later from complications related to blood loss and traumatic brain injury. The cause of death was listed as traumatic injury with contributing hemorrhagic shock. The locking ring was recovered from the back wall of the garage, embedded about 2 inches into the drywall. The deformed seating edge was identified as the point of failure. The compressor, wheel assembly, and tools were documented, and the death was ruled accidental. It is strange how normal a tire looks, considering how much force is waiting inside it. From a garage floor in Arizona to a gym in Toronto, the next death started halfway through a lift, when a tear opened inside a woman's aorta and left her conscious and unable to move while the damage kept spreading. It was January 18, 2020, at a commercial gym in the northern suburbs of Toronto, Canada. Saturday morning, busy enough that most of the racks and machines were in use but not packed. Near the back of the free weight section, a barbell sat loaded with 215 pounds. For about 9 years, Sandra Leclerc had made the gym part of her routine. Not competitive lifting, just consistent. She was 43, in great shape, and had been working toward a personal deadlift record for 2 months. In the weeks before this, she had mentioned a deep ache between her shoulder blades during heavy sets, but figured it was just training fatigue, which is the reasonable assumption. Most lifters would chalk something like that up to fatigue or form without a second thought. That ache matters, but we will get to that. The aorta runs from the heart down through the chest and abdomen, and its wall has layers. In some people, those layers can weaken over time without any symptoms distinct enough to act on. During a heavy lift, pressure inside the chest spikes hard, and if the wall is already compromised, that pressure can force blood between the layers and tear them apart. Survivors describe it as the most severe pain a human being can experience, and depending on the type, it does not knock a person unconscious. It leaves them awake through it while the tear continues moving. Sandra completed 3 warm-up sets and 3 working sets before the lift. Between sets, someone nearby later remembered seeing her reach back and press her fingers between her shoulder blades before standing again. She chalked her hands, set her grip, and pulled 215 pounds, the number she had been working toward for 2 months. The lift stopped near the top. She did not drop the bar. She lowered it back to the floor, grabbed the rack, and went down against it. Then she sat down, one hand going to the floor. As she lowered herself, both hands moved to her chest. A woman nearby came over and crouched beside her. Sandra was pale almost immediately, her breathing shallow and deliberate. She gave short responses when spoken to. At some point in those first few minutes, the woman beside her noticed Sandra looking down at her own legs, then pressing a hand against her thigh. She did not attempt to move from that position again. Responders arrived in 6 minutes and found her still conscious, still upright against the rack, not moving her lower body. By the time they had her on a stretcher, she was unresponsive. She lost consciousness during transport and did not regain it. The cause of death was a complicated type B aortic dissection originating in the descending thoracic aorta, with propagation along the vessel and eventual rupture. As the dissection extended, it had compromised blood supply to the spinal arteries, which accounts for what witnesses observed in her legs during those final minutes. The aortic wall showed cystic medial degeneration, a structural weakness that had been developing silently for years. The ache between her shoulder blades in the weeks prior may have been the wall already failing, presenting in a way that was completely indistinguishable from normal training soreness. The heavy lift was listed as the precipitating event. Her training log on her phone showed the progression of her deadlift over the previous 8 weeks. The final entry that morning listed the session as a personal record attempt. The death was ruled natural. The thing that caused it had been developing silently inside her for years, indistinguishable from the normal wear of someone who took their health seriously. Aortic dissection kills roughly 10,000 people in the United States every year. Most of them had no idea it was coming, and most of them looked perfectly fine, so maybe if something feels wrong during a heavy set, put the bar down. It is not always fatigue. Off the coast of the central Philippines, a tourist picked up a shell while snorkeling, felt what seemed like a tiny pinch, and 23 minutes later, he was still awake while his body forgot how to breathe. It was September 4th, 2016, off the coast of the central Philippines. A shallow reef ran about 80 meters from the beach, clear enough for tourists to snorkel without needing a boat. The water was calm, warm, and only about 5 to 6 feet deep over most of the reef. Aaron Pierce was 29 and from Australia, traveling through Southeast Asia with his girlfriend and 2 friends. He was a strong swimmer, comfortable in the water, and had snorkeled before on vacation. He was not acting reckless that morning. They had rented gear from a beachside shop and waded out from shore without a guide, which was normal for that reef. He had looked up the area, the water conditions, and the kind of fish people usually saw there. But blue-ringed octopuses? That was not exactly front-page tourist information. A blue-ringed octopus is tiny, which is part of the problem. Calm. It can look brownish or yellowish, easy to miss against sand or coral. The blue rings only show when it is stressed. Its bite can feel like a tiny pinch, but the venom contains tetrodotoxin. What does that do? It blocks nerve signals to the muscles, including the ones used for breathing. There is no antivenom. The only real option is mechanical ventilation until the toxin wears off, which can take 4 to 6 hours. Aaron had been in the water about 40 minutes when he surfaced near the group holding a smooth, cone-shaped shell from the reef floor. He turned it over in his hand, felt something like a small pinch in his palm, and dropped it back into the water. Nobody clearly saw what had been inside. They floated for a few more minutes, and then Aaron mentioned his hand felt numb. He figured it was the water or the snorkel grip. They started heading back to shore. By the time they reached the shallows, the numbness had moved into his forearm. He said his legs felt strange, not painful, just slow to respond. Over the next several minutes, the weakness spread. He had trouble holding his head up. His speech slowed and became less clear. His girlfriend stayed beside him while one of his friends moved up the beach trying to get a phone signal. Aaron was awake, aware, and not in pain. That is what makes this one so disturbing. There was no dramatic injury to focus on, no blood, no obvious wound. His body was just quietly disconnecting from him while he watched it happen. His arms stopped responding. He could not sit upright without support. He could hear what people were saying around him and see the faces above him, but he could not move or explain what was happening. The paralysis kept moving inward until it reached the muscles that drive breathing. This is the worst part. Breathing did not stop all at once. Each inhale became shallower, weaker, more delayed. His girlfriend was holding him upright on the sand and could hear the sound changing, faint and effortful, like his body was trying to do something it no longer had the signal to complete. The breaths became quieter, further apart, and then stopped. He lost consciousness on the beach about 23 minutes after leaving the water. One friend reached a signal and called for help while Aaron was still conscious. A resort staff member arrived with a basic first aid kit, but there was no ventilator, no advanced airway equipment, nothing that could breathe for him. He was driven to the nearest clinic, then transferred toward a larger hospital, but was pronounced dead on arrival. The cause of death was respiratory failure from tetrodotoxin envenomation, consistent with a blue-ringed octopus bite. The bite mark on his left palm was less than a centimeter across and had been missed at first. The shell was never recovered, but photos on his phone showed the reef area where he had picked it up. His girlfriend and both friends gave detailed accounts. The death was ruled accidental. The awful thing about this one is that he was not really fighting pain, he was fighting silence inside his own body, fully awake while one system after another shut down.